Well, good morning, everybody. Some of you were up very late last night. it was a great evening, wasn't it? But don't worry, if you're feeling a bit jaded, just settle yourselves in because we've got a really good program for you this morning. My name is Hough, and I'm a board director on EENA, and I'm also editor emeritus of the Crisis Response Journal. Today we're going to talk about communication, technology, and public trust in the future of emergency response. And trust is something that I have researched and written about quite extensively because I consider it to be one of the most important resources to keeping our societies resilient, safe, and secure. Yet trust needs nurturing to remain strong and can easily be lost in a single moment of carelessness or inconsistency. And I'd say we live in times where emergency communication is arguably more important than ever, and at a time when suspicion and mistrust are burgeoning. And we only have to look at some of the hysteria in some sectors surrounding the UK emergency test, which is happening this Sunday. It's already been dubbed the Armageddon alerts by some media, and I would personally argue that the communications around this test, which frankly should not be controversial, have been found wanting. Now, Professor Keri Stephens has been researching communication technology for many, many years, especially within human contexts. She's going to share examples of the pivotal role that human decisions play when preparing and executing emergency communications. And she's also going to enlighten us on the thorny question of how do we get the public and other stakeholders to trust the evolving science of emergency response. Keri.
Well, I'm happy to be here with you here today. Really enjoyed my time here and getting to know so many people. And I'd really like to just dive right in and take a look at some of the challenges we have around trust, technologies, and communication. So, you know what? Science is really important. And I think we all agree that that is the case. But science by itself is just not quite enough. Well, we also know that emergency response is really important. But emergency response is the same way. It's not quite enough in all situations. And then all of a sudden when COVID hit, everything became a lot more focused around some of the challenges that we are now facing. And actually, we've probably faced them for a very long time. As a communication researcher, I have been studying how people use words, how we use various messages to influence, to affect, to get people to take protective actions. And I was absolutely shocked during COVID because if you look in many different countries, we did not follow the evidence base that has been established in a broad field of communication. So now, we certainly know a whole lot more about what was inadequate about our communication practices. And now it's time for us to shift that because we're realizing things that we knew all along. The public can't stand it when we're late with our messages. I'll share some examples later of situations where the public said, you know what? We can't get the authorities to tell us anything that's going on in a timely manner. And what do they do when that happens? What do? They either turn to each other or they make stuff up, right? They're going to come up with a solution whether we provide it or not. The public also can't stand inconsistent messages. It's really frustrating to be told one thing and then be told another thing. People who don't understand that science evolves, it's a tough situation, I think, for us to try to communicate. So our challenges, I think, that we learned through COVID is that a whole lot more organizations have to communicate with their stakeholders than have ever done that before. The other big challenge we have is that we have lots of different stakeholders who have differing degrees of trust. And by the way, that includes the emergency response community. So I'm going to share some examples of that as I bring communication into focus today. I'll cover 4 things. I'll talk about these challenges around the evolving nature of science. I'll share some examples of a human AI teaming study that we did that involved emergency managers as part of our research team. And then I'll talk about ongoing infrastructure disasters that we're having right now in the US. And I think you'll see that they resonate across the rest of the world. I think we're all struggling with some of this right now. And I'll end by just a few thoughts on the future of public response. So, evolving science, my goodness. Uncertainty, we heard a talk yesterday that talked about uncertainty as well as ambiguity. These are things that a lot of humans don't deal well with. The other thing is imprecision. It's kind of interesting because I would say that only in certain fields are people trained to value precision. However, across the board, when things change, even people who weren't trained to value that feel the effects of this imprecise type of communication. We also have these dreadful situations where research is done completely separate from practice, and so a lot of times researchers are working on problems that are not problems for the practice community. Have you experienced that before? As a researcher, I feel like I can pick on us a little bit because sometimes we definitely do that. And then we're dealing now with kind of this change and trying to shift people's mindsets from command and control more to how are we going to be able to be innovative and flexible enough that we can work with people and explain to them things that are going on. Now, COVID in particular, I think that all of us found that some of our structures that we have in place were incompatible with COVID. I would say one of the biggest examples that many of us saw is how many of you get together whenever there is an emergency situation face to face and really coordinate those situations. That's the way that our field has always done things, because there's something about that human nature of interacting and being close to someone where you can start to understand one another a lot better. And all of a sudden, COVID, we couldn't do that. And that really forced us to change some of the ways that we communicate. The other thing that we started realizing is we can't just send a bunch of communication messages one direction, because that's not good enough. People want bi-directional communication, and that takes a whole lot more work than us just to disseminate information. There's a huge difference. I call that dissemination when it's one way. It's communication when it's bi-directional. We also saw that a lot of what I call public technologies, things like social media, really did outpace the speed at which emergency response could share information. And like I said, if people aren't getting what they want, they will start making things up. And that's a lot of the reason why we saw such a spread of mis and disinformation. And then finally, we have even work organizations have realized they can play a really important role in communicating about important things like health. I'm going to share next some examples of what I've heard from emergency managers. Before I do this, I just want to tell you all, I know the status of Twitter right now is a mess. I don't have any idea. I do not have a crystal ball to tell you what's going to happen on that. I hope we can all hang in there a little while, because what we have learned, I think, as a community, is that some of these social media platforms where people can publicly post can give us some very valuable information, and I hope we can get back to that point. I interviewed one emergency manager, and he literally explained, Twitter in particular, about being one of the better approaches for finding out information that he didn't even know he needed to look for or ask for. And then another person that I talked with that was a federal emergency manager, he was talking about, things are changing so rapidly with technology that if we don't find ways to automate the processing of technology, we're not going to be able to keep up as a field. But there's a lot of problems. And that is, a lot of emergency response organizations don't have the resources. to monitor social media, to use these sophisticated tools. I know we definitely have some vendors here and suppliers and members of this community that are doing some great work around trying to make that technology easier for everyone to use. But resources are a really serious issue because the public also doesn't expect one message a day or 2 messages a day. They expect this bidirectional, and sometimes they want updates every hour. And if we don't give it to them, like I said, they're going to make it up. And furthermore, these emergency managers also need to trust the data that's out there. That's where I think the Twitter situation is really delicate right now. And y'all, it brings us back to the fact that when we're communicating about evolving situations, it's tough. It's really tough to communicate that. So I'll share one example here. During COVID, we pulled in an emergency manager on our research team, and we did some human AI teaming. And I'll explain what we did. We looked at some crowdsourcing data, and we did a couple of things differently than what most of the research and practice out there is doing. First of all, we included the emergency manager on our team. He actually engaged in the research, helped us rewrite the research questions. He also said, I don't care about those keywords that you're looking for on Twitter. I don't care about those images. I want these. And so he gave us a lot of really fantastic input. The other thing we did differently is we used community emergency response teams. And in the US, those are a group of volunteers who are trained, so they have some emergency knowledge. A lot of times they work closely with emergency management. They were our humans who did the work around our training of our machine learning algorithms. We also, as COVID was unfolding, we were doing this research project, so it was near real time, and it was multi-phased. And then what my team did is we got on Zoom with the human labelers, the CERT team members, and we observed and asked questions about how they were making decisions of what was important for emergency response and what wasn't. And the system, if you're curious, that we used was Citizen Helper. It's out there in several of the even international publications. So our overarching research question was, can we do a better job by understanding the people that are training our data? Because those of you who are familiar with some of the controversies right now around machine learning and around artificial intelligence, one of the big issues is the data we have trained is biased. And we're using people who are biased, a lot of times actually more highly educated, is what my understanding is with ChatGPT right now. We have an educated training system as opposed to the average education level of the population. So we have a lot to overcome. So we did a lot of interviews. We interviewed the same people over and over again as they were labeling this data. So here were a few of the key things that we found. First of all, these community emergency response team volunteers, it doesn't matter what their background is. They can do these different processes, but they do need some training. And the training seems to be really key. The other thing we found out is we had 2 phases of the project. In the first phase, we were using our CERT team volunteers to help train the machines. And then in the second phase, we fed data back to them, and we asked them to correct the machines. That correcting the machines, very stressful, much harder. All of a sudden, they felt like they were second-guessing an algorithm. And I hoped, like ever, I would have at least a DOI number, our paper on this, where we really lay this whole argument out, is accepted. It'll come out in June in human-machine communication, because I think we have some pretty interesting insights in here. We also found that people who knew their local communities were really valuable in being able to label the training data. And so essentially what we did is we were trying to figure out We'd heard repeatedly that emergency managers don't trust machine learning, and so how do we go about starting to tackle this issue? That was our approach, to bring experts in emergency management onto our team. And I think we've made some progress, but we still have a long way to go. I think this will be an ongoing kind of thing, but boy, if I were to give anybody some advice, it's involve the experts in your machine learning training, because they will take a different approach than if you leave them out. Let's talk now about an infrastructure disaster. And unfortunately, we've had this ongoing in the US and where I live in Austin, Texas. All right, those of you who I told last night, I'm gonna have a picture of a longhorn in here. This is my longhorn. Her name is Milo. And what are you supposed to do? Is there anybody who was sober enough when we were talking about this? You're supposed to yell Longhorn, okay? So anyway, I see some people yell Longhorn, come on. All right, awesome. So we have had some interesting challenges in Texas. And I thought I would show a map to explain to you some of kind of the arrogance that we have sometimes in Texas. What you're gonna notice about our electric grid here is that Texas has a grid all to itself. Well, the reason this is a problem is that if you look at the northwestern and the midwestern part of the US, they handle cold weather, ice storms on a regular basis. They still have gotten hit pretty hard this year. But if you look at us down here, we don't even have snow plows. Whenever we get a serious winter storm, people can't drive on the roads because they can't make them safe. We can't walk on sidewalks. I mean, it's really serious. You become homebound, a lot like COVID, actually, when this happens. This February, we had this happen. This, by the way, is in my front yard, my poor oak tree. We have a lot of very old oak trees. We had about 2 inches of ice that covered our trees. The reason this is so important is that our power lines are not buried in all places. So we had tree limbs falling on our power lines. We're the 11th largest city in the US, and over half of our metropolitan population was without power for between 2 and 6 days. Y'all, nobody said anything. The power utilities, the city, for 3 days, we had no communication. Our city manager lost his job, and we just had the head of our power organization retire. But there were 12 public information officers also a part of that organization, and I don't understand why somebody wasn't jumping up and down saying, you can't leave everybody in the dark. And that's exactly what they did. But I really do think that they're learning. Utilities have never had to really communicate to the public like they have to now. And we had very severe consequences of the storm. You know, we had people were without water also for sometimes over a week. We had a lot of under-resourced communities that were hit the hardest, and we just had a publication come out where we demonstrate that this happened. Pipes froze in the homes and they burst. We don't bury our pipes because historically we haven't gotten that type of cold weather. And of course, people couldn't drive on the icy road. And ultimately, we had quite a few deaths that resulted from this infrastructure winter storm. Now, if you look at the nature of this cascading disaster, and I use cascading because if you kind of look at all that happened, it was an ice storm, then we lost power, then we lost water, then we had fires. I mean, it goes on and on. We had multiple disasters all happening in one. And it really does reveal just how important it is to communicate around infrastructure. And it's also pretty similar to some of the challenges that we saw during COVID. The utility companies now realize that they need to be communicating. We're having lots more conversation. And these communication challenges, they really do heighten the public's uncertainty, and we've seen it completely erode trust. And I have some examples to share with you. We had several interviewees who were either pregnant or had small children. And they were talking about being afraid of, they didn't even trust the water if they boiled it because they didn't want to hurt the baby that was inside of them or their newborn. Lots of uncertainty. These mothers were frustrated, and so they started these private social media groups to swap diapers, to swap formula, to really help one another because they felt like the utilities and the local emergency response community couldn't help them. We also saw that they used groups called Buy Nothing groups, if y'all have heard of those, Facebook groups, lots of different kinds of social media were used. And essentially the other thing that we had happen hit the medical community also. Here's a quote from a person who worked at a dialysis clinic. They were told nothing about how to handle their patients during this disaster. And ultimately, everyone said information came too late. So there were a lot of different communication tools that were used, but people still weren't happy. So we used wireless emergency alert system messages. By the way, they weren't designed properly. I was super excited to see that France actually has a protocol in a talk given here for how to send out those messages. And by the way, that protocol really fits well with what the research says is a best practice in sending these alert messages out. We talked about those public information officers that people had. And then the utility companies kept going through our local weather forecasters. I don't know if y'all have this issue, but in the US, no one under 30, and you might be able to go up to 40 now, watches the local news. Everybody's getting everything on their phone. And so a lot of these trusted channels that we have to communicate, the younger generation, we're going to have to think creatively. We have a ton of work. That's actually the age group I'm the most worried about moving forward. If we don't figure out how to reach them, they will never trust us. And that's the group that we really need to build the trust in for the future. And our outage maps didn't work either. So let me show you an example of what the outage maps. People would be posting on the outage maps telling the utility that their power was out and the app wasn't working fast enough. And this is one of my favorite comments. People literally said things like, "The map gaslights me by showing that all is fine." You know, people don't like it when they report things and they don't get that validation that they have been heard. We also saw in the after action reports, communication is listed as the #1 issue that all of these different utilities faced. Let's take a look at this example. Y'all notice something here? So at the top, the message is designed for Spanish speakers. Look at the infographic. It's in English. So I think this really speaks to how important it is to have messages pre-designed, right? Use templates. Really think these things through because in the heat of the moment, it's normal to make mistakes like this. But unfortunately, this communication tool just didn't work because it wasn't pre-planned. And then one more example, y'all. All right, you ready for this? Okay, so do this, immediately limit all your water use. Oh, but the water is safe to drink. Now, stop doing this and conserve and everything. And but there's this huge problem at our utility plant. Do you really think anybody thought the water was safe to drink after such a screwed up message? This is such evidence that in the moment, even good communicators make mistakes. And we have to think about this stuff before the disasters hit. I'm going to end by talking just kind of briefly about where I think we go from here in terms of the future of emergency response. All of our scope has been tremendously expanded. And so if we build these great cutting-edge technology tools, all these different apps, but we leave the people out, we don't involve them in the design process that are going to use them, we'll never be able to communicate with them. The other thing is, if we don't think about how we talk about technology and the use of technology, we risk alienating the public. And then I really want us to think a lot about the fact that communication is not just talking about something. It's strategic, it's evidence-based, and it's bidirectional. And then finally, I think researchers need to be integral and a part of the practice community because we have to be working together on this moving forward. So, a few last things. I think that this is a real challenge because once we lose trust, it's very, very hard to get it back. But pre-planning can help with a lot of these challenges. The other thing is we need to listen to our stakeholders. I heard lots of examples of including the stakeholders who will use technologies in the design at this conference, and I think that's really inspiring and the way to go. And then, boy, we need to get out of these silos. I'll give you a couple of examples. I hope up on one of my websites now is a public-facing abstract of an article that we just published in Risk Analysis, and it's a structural equation model. It's really hard to read unless you happen to know that area of statistics. We need to take the time as researchers to translate our own work because we're translating it for other well-educated people. Not everybody has had a class in structural equation modeling, and they could have a PhD in another field and not know what that is. We need to be really sensitive to that, I think, as researchers. The other thing we need to do is we need to publish with the practice community. I was super excited. Our team helped to run a wildfire evacuation drill with a community around the Austin, Texas area. And I published with a firefighter in Fire magazine. And then we turned around and we took the academic version of that and published it in an academic journal, just as examples. And I personally am really committed to trying to improve this. The last couple of things is, I think all of us want to think about the fact that communication is complex. It's easy sometimes to say, just get the message out there, just communicate it. How many of you heard that? You've probably heard that if you're in this field. People talk about this. But y'all, it is a lot more complicated than just get the message out. The other thing is that I think it's important for us to continue innovating with our technologies and making sure that there is a great mix between the way we use technology, the way we involve humans, and the way that communication evolves. Because ultimately, if we're going to get people to trust us, we need to do these things. And I think quite often we forget that one of the great channels to send our information is through trusted community partners, NGOs, all these different groups who already have the trust of these communities we want to reach. And I think our future is all about the nature of partnerships. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and end there, and we'll open it up for questions.
Excuse me. Thank you, Keri. So, I mean, I found that was absolutely fascinating, and as you say, we could have talked forever about this, and it really is. Technology is part of the solution, but humans are at the center of everything. The practitioners, the communities, partners, and the public all have to be involved, or you are just missing the point completely. Does anyone in the audience have any questions for Keri? Is there a microphone? If you could say where you're from as well, please, because we can't really see you out there. Thanks.
Yes, good morning. Antoine Trarieux from EMA Group in France. Thanks very much, Keri, for this fascinating intervention.
Thank you.
My question was, I was very impressed by what you provide us as a piece of reflection, a track for reflection, but have you seen things changing in Austin, Texas since these events 2-3 years ago, and due to the fact that, yes, you are launching alerts in this way, so are you considering that things are changing now or not yet?
Whoa, what a great question. You know, I would have thought that after the severe winter storm in 2021, things would have changed. But we just had the ice storm in February of 23. I would argue we had an even bigger set of communication issues. I do know that everyone after 2021 did a really good job with after-action reports, and I think that people know a lot of the problems, but I actually think they haven't invested in what they need to fix the problems. It takes people. It takes getting the right people to help you pre-plan those messages. We knew there were problems with that emergency, with the energy app. It didn't work in 2021. It also didn't work in 2023. And so I'm hoping that now, after you have two things that major in a major metropolitan area, short period of time, that people are going to pay attention, but they're going to have to put some money toward solving the problem and realize that communication makes a really big difference, and we have a long way to go. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there any? Yes, this gentleman here, please.
Hi.
Could we pass the microphone back? Okay. Speak loud. Oh, hang on. Here you go. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for your talk. You have insisted, and it's correct, about the trust. But in case of disaster, there are always mistakes made. Mm-hmm. And I think something that you did not explicitly mention is transparency.
Yes.
I mean, that's also very important stuff, because in such disasters like the one you explained, there is no way you can be perfectly right at the first time.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, the whole reason that I showed you the people's reactions to the outage map, their efforts were trying to be transparent, to show what was out, what was being fixed, but they weren't fast enough at working on that app. And so transparency is really important. And my comment back to the utility was, why didn't you just put a message up there that said, hey y'all, we can't keep up with all the reports. This might not be accurate, check back. There were ways they could have communicated very transparently, and I actually think people would have understood that. We are all now, you put it in a different context, we've all experienced data outages, data issues with websites crashing. It's a very similar concept. So people understand that in heavy use times, systems don't work perfectly, but they never once put a message up there or sent it out. And so transparency, I think, is super important. Thanks for that comment.
Do you feel that sometimes, whatever the organization, there is their sort of internal culture that you cannot admit mistakes? And that's where one of the things that I've sort of learned about communication, especially in large organizations, is that you've got the people who are doing the communications, but then you have the legal department and human resources and everyone else wanting to jump in. So they can almost become paralyzed into not being transparent because they're scared of what to say and whether the press will pick it up.
So that's all very fair, and that definitely happens. And the other related issue, I think, is that sometimes the people who are your designated communicators, let's say a public information officer type person, they're not given the power or the place in the room where the decisions, the high-level decisions are made. And so they may have the executives or the higher-level people making decisions in the organization who aren't the communication experts in the room. And so these power differentials that we find in organizations, I think, are also contributing to a lot of this problem.
And I know for a fact that a lot of the emergency management side, not even the communicators, they also don't always have the seat at the top table when it comes to discussions and planning, yet everyone expects everything to work seamlessly when there is a major crisis.
That's right.
Are there any, does anyone else have any, there's a question down here actually.
Yes, thank you. So this is from Ashley, just sitting down here. I'm Ashley from the UK, and your presentation was very interesting, talking about public trust with emergency authorities. And I have actually been through a few personal experiences, and I know from other deaf people around the world that access to sign language about these emergencies is terrible, because you'll see news going on, hearing people panicked about something, but because sign language is my first language and everything is in spoken English, written English, I won't know on earth what's going on. For example, with Australian bushfires, there was deaf people who missed so much information and were at so much risk. In America, there's tornadoes, all sorts of things. There's no interpreter, so the information isn't out there. So is it basically that deaf people don't have an emergency service? These sorts of things really should be put into consideration when services have been planning and been planned, and it's always an afterthought.
I think you raise an excellent point. You know, in my opinion, there are a few places that I've seen in the US that do a nice job of multiple languages, and they include sign language as well. But it's very few. Most do not. The other thing that we see is a rise in these services where people can register if they have needs like sign language, mobility disabilities, and so people can register to get help during an emergency. But I will tell you, we've just done an investigation of the state of Texas, and the system that we have set up right now, people have to re-register every single year to stay in the system, and it is a nightmare to get people to register in the first place. And so I understand the reasons why they do that. They want it to be current, but it is a really complicated mess, and I agree with you. We need to prioritize the needs of our citizens, and it takes extra effort, it takes extra cost, but it's important and it's worth it. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more, because in some ways, you said, you know, you can register. But if you're traveling, do you have to register in every single place? And it's like parking apps, isn't it? That must be an absolute nightmare. That's not acceptable at all. And I think from David Wales, who was speaking yesterday, and he was saying that, you know, sometimes nobody ever categorizes themselves as a hard-to-reach community. It's just the attitude of the people who are putting out the messages who don't take time to understand the needs.
That's right.
And it's a lack of understanding too, isn't it?
It is.
And, we've got lots of questions now, so we'll come to you first, and then we'll go to you at the back.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ivana Mangione. I'm from Italy, and I work on an emergency helpline for children. I just echo what Keri said earlier on about the fact that the younger generations technically rely on social media and gaming and whatever platform as adults technically are not really comfortable with or not necessarily know very well. In emergency, in particular, our helpline exploded, as you can imagine, during COVID, because that was one of the channels where kids basically could write to us through chats in particular, and talk to us about any questions about things that they read on the social media. So on the back of this, and very much in line with what you said earlier on, there are groups of people that literally are left out during emergency, and children, young people, or people with certain disabilities definitely are something that all the big companies and the technology needs to be looking at in the future. I don't know if that is happening already, but please think all collectively about it. One of the things we are forced to start to look into is artificial intelligence. And the exercise you mentioned earlier on about having somebody sitting with our team is probably something we'll start to work on to automatically start to feed the machine on top of all the 35 years experience of data we've got.
Absolutely, and we're only going to see that rise, that use. And right now I have several different research projects going on where we're looking at kind of how the machines were trained, and then how they have learned over time, and how they have increased the biases that they have. We've really got to look at how that data gets into these systems, and I think people are talking about it, But the problem is we already have a lot of existing systems that are working on all of this initially biased data. So there's a lot of talk about it. I'm actually optimistic that we're going to tackle some of that, because if we don't, we realize what we will perpetuate moving forward as AI and machine learning is pulled into a whole lot of different aspects of our jobs.
Thank you. Well, we're nearly out of time, but I am going to squeeze one last question in if we can be quick. So, all the way up there.
Good morning. Stephen Hines from London. Most of the audience probably aren't aware that yesterday morning, most of Florida was woken up because someone accidentally sent an emergency text alert. That's been followed by a whole raft of people saying, you've got to turn these off, worse than we've seen in the UK. What do you think Florida needs to do now to regain that trust?
You know, I think that some of the most powerful words out there are, I am sorry. I made a mistake. Owning up to these mistakes that we make and reminding people that we are learning how to use these technologies is incredibly important. First of all, everybody knows they made a mistake. They might as well admit it, right? That gets to this notion of being transparent, being honest, being open, admitting there are issues, and then trying to move forward to rebuild trust quickly. And I think that a lot of times people make excuses, and we have moved beyond excuses, in my opinion, in the world today, because we don't want to hear it. But that, I'm sorry, I apologize, we made a mistake, and furthermore, this is how we have fixed it to make sure it won't happen again. In the crisis communication literature, there's a concept for not just apologizing, but telling the public how you're going to fix it so that it won't happen again. I think that's really, really important.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, thank you so much.
Thank you.